Today, I'm proud to present to you my capstone, Misplaced Matter, Nanushka Fall 2030. I want to begin by asking you, what are you wearing? When I compliment my friends on their outfits, they typically respond in one out of two ways. Either they tell me about how they got this clothes for a really great deal, either at a thrift store or online, or they tell me about how it has a really cool story behind it, either a gift from a family member or friend for a special event. So clearly we care a lot about our clothes and where they come from. Clothes matter. As Virginia Woolf said, vain trifles as they seem, clothes change our view of the world and our world's view of us. It's our quote-unquote chosen skin. Fashion is uniquely human. It's part of what sets us apart from all kinds of living species. It's part of what makes us so unique, and it's also one of the most influential phenomena in Western civilization since the Renaissance that lies near the center of the modern world, as Lars Svensson said. Not only that, but fashion is also universally human, and even in cultures without the garment industry, we clothe ourselves with tattoos, with perfume, and jewelry. Fashion can communicate meaning. It changes how we interact with the world. It informs our behavior, augments our reality, and can connect us to a group or show what we believe. But it's also the third highest polluter on the planet after construction and transportation. However, it's not entirely your fault. 70% of that waste happens before it's in the store, and the carbon emissions released are primarily in the early stages of production. So this brings me to my design brief. For this project, I wanted to design a sustainable garment that applies materials innovatively to address the problem of pollution. First, I'll be telling you about the problem more in depth. Then, I'll be sharing some of the materials that are contributing the most to that problem. After that, we'll talk about 2030 and some of the current innovations that might be building a better future. Then, I'll share with you my design and my collection, and finally, we'll talk about where the future is going and how we'll get there. First, the problem. Fashion is either creative to the point of being art or exploitative to the point of criminality. So like I already said, I need this to be a garment that's sustainable. So what is sustainability? It's a combination of three factors, and this is also called the triple baseline model, or the 3 Ps: environmental, economic, and social, or planet, profit, and people. All three of these things need to come together to create something that's truly sustainable. If any of them is out of balance, then this won't be something that can last, and that's really what sustainability comes down to. It's something that can last a long time. How does fashion add up for sustainability? Well, if we look first at the profit, it's looking pretty good, with the overall value being $1.3 trillion. That's also 2% of the global economy, or double the size of the pharmaceutical industry. If we look at people, at first glance, it looks pretty good, with 3.4 billion people working in the fashion industry, or 6% of all workers on the planet. However, if we dig a little deeper, we realize that fewer than 2% of those people are earning a living wage. 98% aren't, and especially those who are living in the global south, or countries that aren't as financially viable. Finally, the planet. And this is the one I'll be emphasizing the most in this presentation. Every year, the fashion industry creates over 17,000 tons of waste, making it the third highest polluter on the planet. Out of that waste, 85% goes directly to landfills, and that other 15% is something I'll talk about later on. So if we return to that triple circle model, we can see that the environmental aspect is the most heavily impacted. The social is also very problematic, but we don't have time to get into that. And then the economic is something that's thriving solely based on the disparity of the other two. However, when we think about this in terms of sustainability, this isn't something that can last a long time. The economic impact will come later on when the environmental and social come to take their dues. Here we can see a graph that's documenting two different rates of growth. One is the world's population, that dotted line that's fairly constant. And the other is all of the textiles currently being used, from cotton to polyester. The polyester is the one in green, and you can see that there's the most stark growth there. The rate of growth for our use of polyester and the amount of production it's being made for has actually surpassed the rate of growth for the world population. Like I said, these fibers have outstripped growth for this world's population, and to make matters worse, over 75% of that is now synthetic. So I mentioned earlier that there was 85% going directly to landfills. Well, 15% of that is either recycled or donated, but there currently isn't a reliable or efficient way to recycle most fibers, especially the polyester that I talked about a minute ago. Donation itself is becoming another ecological problem, and waste often ends up in other countries that don't have good waste disposal, meaning that it ends up polluting the water and air. All of this brings us back to this linear model. So when we produce things like polyester and other synthetic materials, we bring it through what's called a linear process. So it creates the raw materials, and then those are used by the companies and used by people, and then by the end of its life, it's not able to return to something usable. Like I said, most fibers can't be recycled or reused. However, despite this being a linear model, it isn't equal throughout every step of the process. 45% of waste comes in the material and production phase, while company interaction produces 23% and the end of life 32%. Fiber productions alone create 2/3 of a garment's total carbon emissions. So when we looked at that graph earlier, 2/3 of all waste is coming just from that part. Let's play a little game. Between these two people, who do you think is more sustainable? First, the woman on the left buys a lot of new and eco-friendly products that are made with the environment in mind, but are new. And compare that to an older woman who maybe rarely buys anything new and reuses everything, almost like my grandma. If you guessed the woman on the right, well, you're right. She, just by reusing and not buying as many new things, is reducing that carbon footprint by almost 70%. But we still need to buy new products sometimes. When we need to do that, what other choices do we have than to buy into that linear model we just discussed? The fashion industry is changing. As Eileen Fisher said, it's no longer enough to do less harm. We actually want to make clothes in a way that makes things better. It's key to remember with all this talk about sustainability that the environment does not exist as a sphere separate from human actions, ambitions, and needs. We're breathing the same air that they breathe on the other side of the world, and like it or not, we're still impacted by the waste that's still going into those other countries. So what needs to change? What is the hidden problem, and how do we address that? It's the materials that we're using. 2020 was a crossover year for so many reasons. There was a study done in 2020 that measured the total weight of all man-made materials like concrete or steel. This is also called anthropogenic mass. They then compared this to the weight of all natural materials, from animals to bacteria to trees and plants. And they actually found that the unnatural, synthetic, man-made materials actually outweigh the natural materials on the planet. For a more specific example, I've shown the total weight of plastic compared to all animals on the planet. As you can see, it's actually doubled the weight of all animals. I think we need to reconsider what we're making things with. When it comes to the fashion industry, as I said earlier, 2/3 of the carbon footprint comes from fibers, and synthetic fibers have been on a skyrocketing rise. The two that have the biggest impact are nylon on the left and polyester on the right. Both of these materials are non-renewable and are made from crude oil, which uses around 342 million barrels per year. But with all of this in mind, we need to remember that nature is resilient. So the real question is, how do we design to support nature, and how can we apply this thought pattern to fashion? What we're creating with needs to change. And fortunately, we're already on a trajectory towards that. I'll be telling you now about the year 2030 and what materials we'll be making things with. I want to tell you about 3 material innovations that are currently in the works that I think will change how we're designing in the future. First, let me tell you about mushroom leather, then I'll mention briefly regenerative wool farming, and finally, I'll briefly touch on natural fiber welding. So what is mycelium, and why would you ever make clothes out of it? Well, mycelium is an early stage in mushroom growth. First, a mushroom releases spores, which then they land in the ground and become what's called hyphae, and then from those it grows into a root structure, almost like your brain neural pathways, called mycelium. This mycelium is the most high in genetic diversity, which makes it a prime stage for what they call synthetic biology, or the ways in which we can innovate with nature. The process for making mycelium comes in more or less 3 steps. First, they grow the mycelium in long sheets. Then those sheets are pressed down and processed, usually given some sort of backing to support it. Finally, they use natural tannins to complete the tanning process and create something that can still biodegrade at the end of its life. Some of the benefits to using mycelium leather are that it can be completed in 2 weeks, that it uses a fraction of the water that normal leather production does, and it can be done without the use of harsh chemicals. The concept of regenerative farming isn't necessarily new, but we're taking it more seriously than we ever have before. The idea is that by farming in a certain way, you can actually create a carbon negative environment rather than producing carbon at the end of it. This is currently being applied to merino wool, and the sheep actually aerate the soil and create a carbon negative environment, all while then having a really high quality merino wool outcome. Another concept I want to introduce you to very briefly is natural fiber welding. This is a cotton strand before and after this process was accomplished. Typically, when you want to achieve a certain result, you have to alter the natural materials extremely in order to make those outcomes happen. This is usually done using chemicals or other harsh treatments. However, using natural fiber welding, you simply use an ionization process. It's salt-based, and at the end of it, you end up with an extremely strong strand. I think all of this points to a new biomaterial age. A biomaterial is simply something that is natural and can biodegrade at the end of its life. Biomaterials have long been a part of all of our lives, from the wood that you had on your favorite dining room table to the cotton that you wear on your favorite clothes. Applications from clothing to architecture have doubled in interest since 2020, and so has the financial investment in those. How we design is changing. I was inspired by the work of Neri Oxman for this project, whose main tenet is grown instead of made. She says the future of design is a future where anything material in the environment, whether it's wearables, cars, buildings, can take part in the natural ecology. She believes that someday in the future we'll be making cars that when you're done with them, rather than sit in an empty lot and take up space, they can biodegrade and actually nourish the environment. All of this brings me to my collection, Misplaced Matter, Nanushka Fall 2030. Nanushka is a Hungarian-based brand that prioritizes sustainability throughout their design process, and they say that their aesthetic is the modern bohemian. The industry is headlong into an exciting new phase, and Nanushka is at the forefront. This is what Nanushka said about the materials they're using, which is why I chose them. This is a simple 2x2 matrix measuring different kinds of fashion, from utility to decorative and from cheap to expensive. If we look in the bottom left corner, you can see basic commodities that are cheap and meet our needs. And in the top right corner, we can see haute couture, which is highly decorative but also highly expensive and not very practical. For this collection, I wanted it to sit on the higher end price-wise but more focused on utility. This is also where Nanushka fits. Here's an overall mood board for this collection. I wanted it to feel natural and very grounded in the materials. Who are the main users of this product? Let me introduce you to Erica Cremini, a 70-year-old caterer whose focus for clothes is mainly on how comfortable it is. She's most susceptible to impulse buying based on what's most comfortable, but not necessarily considering the full story behind it. For her, clothes have to be comfortable, they have to be enduring, and they have to be tasteful. Next, Oliver Morrill. He's a 26-year-old videographer who focuses the most on the aesthetics when he purchases clothing. He's a storyteller, so he's most susceptible to falling for the stories from corporations when they say something sustainable, also called greenwashing. For him, clothes have to be unique, they must be honest, and they must be packable because he travels a lot. Finally, Chanterelle Jean. She's a 17-year-old high school student whose information primarily comes from social media, so she can tend to get a little bit of misinformation on some topics. But for her, her key need for clothing is to create change. Clothes must be ethically made, meaningful, and beautiful for her to purchase them. Next, let's look at the design of this jacket. It's something really, really simple, and it's something that can go with almost all the clothes you already have in your wardrobe, so you don't have to change everything you're already wearing to implement this outfit. So it's something that's fairly straightforward, and I wanted it to be something people could wear when they go out to experience nature. Next, let's look at some of the prototypes I did. First, I did a paper test. It was simply a half model, just figuring out what could go where. Next, I actually got a jacket from Goodwill, and I tore it apart to figure out how the pieces went together. Then, from using that template, I created my own to build a new paper version. Then I created a fabric prototype with some cheap fabric. Then I realized that I don't know anything about pattern building, and one of my good friends, Sarah, helped me figure out which pattern to use, and I found something that matched my style aesthetic that I just altered a tiny bit for my final design. And this is how the process went. I cut all the pieces and I sewed them together, and here's how the final jacket turned out. For this project, I needed to learn a new CAD modeling program called Clo3D. Clo3D takes a 2D pattern and translates that into a 3D space. Here are those 3 designs that I created with the names for each of the users. Erica's is comfortable, and Oliver's is mostly focused on creating something that's a little quirky, and it uses some of the natural mushroom leather. And finally, Chanterelle's, something that's just engaging and fun to adventure in the world with. For these 3 users, I took their key needs and I designed for them. So how does this measure up? Well, I think for profit, it's not necessarily making as much money because it's simply a higher quality material and it just costs more. So it's less, but the people who buy it have more of an investment in the story behind it. So it's less, but better. Next, let's look at the people. Well, I can't really get into this too much, but I think simply by using more natural materials and sourcing natural dyes, the working conditions for users are highly improved. Finally, the planet. Rather than creating a negative impact through the pollution of the process, this actually creates something positive, releasing nutrition at the end of its life. With all these spheres coming together, this is how they looked before, and I think they can look better in the future, and maybe we can bring it back to homeostasis. If we look at the overall life cycle before, it was highly linear, but now it reflects more of a mushroom's life cycle, and the end of life is simply the beginning for the next phase. Moving forward, I think it's all of our story. Being sustainable is a team sport. It's not about one person doing everything right, but all of us doing our share and giving our part. But what can we do today? I think we can take our time when we purchase a new product and ask ourselves if we really need it. We can hold companies accountable when they say that something is sustainable and make sure that their facts are right. Finally, let's look at 2050. 2050, we could come into a store and they could automatically measure, and working with a program similar to Clo 3D, they could create patterns that are unique to us and right to scale for all the needs that we have for our clothes. The designers who make these could be people that live in these third world countries that are currently being exploited. Like I said, 98% of them aren't being paid a livable wage. What if those people could be the ones designing the clothes and sending them to the stores near us, the programs creating the outfits that are then 3D printed in the back, which you then come later and pick up so that it's made directly for your size, designed by someone in a country that's currently simply working and manufacturing someone else's products. So, what are you wearing? What if when your friends come up and compliment you on your outfit, you could tell them that it was made using something like mycelium or a natural material that at the end of its life actually releases nutrition into the planet? Thank you.